Welcome back, everyone. This is another episode of the SERMAPod. Great to have you. This is the podcast for the Sports and Entertainment Risk Management Alliance. I'm Rich Lenkov, CEO and founder of SERMA, and most often the host of this podcast, although we'll tell all our members who are watching that we're always interested in having members help with content and help host the SERMAPod. So if you're interested, let us know. But we're really privileged to have today John Frost, who's a vice president with Marsh. He's a former deputy sheriff in Eaton County, Michigan. He's a former sergeant in the Marine Corps. We thank you very much for your service, John. And we welcome you today to the SERMAPod.
Thanks, Rich. Thanks for having me.
John, also you work closely with one of our advisory board members, Warren Harper, who is the managing director at Marsh USA. He handles the sports and entertainment practice. So we want to give a shout out to Warren and his great team. So, John, we're talking today about, we've talked frequently on, in SERMA over the last almost 4 years we've been around, about the importance more than ever, as we see with, increasing unfortunate prevalence of attacks and incidents at venues. We talk frequently about the importance of securing venues, securing arenas. We've got lots of members, lots of folks watching and listening to this podcast. We're engaged in that every day. I was speaking at the Stadium Managers Alliance event in California in a few weeks on some of these topics. So you're here today because you've got lots of experience in this area, and also to talk about the CISA, which is I hope I'm pronouncing that right, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. They have a guide, which I'm sure lots of folks aren't aware of, but it's the Venue Guide for Security Considerations. We're going to talk about that a little bit today. So talk to us about what that is, first of all, and we'll get into sort of how it's used in a moment.
Yeah, Rich. So this guide came out earlier this year. CISA produces a lot of security, physical security and cybersecurity guidelines, advice, forms that agencies can use. And this one specifically was a guide that just kind of aims to assist venue operators, kind of identifying and trying to manage some of those risks that we see around venue security. So it's not a hard and fast rule for everything. It's just another tool for venue managers to kind of have in their tool belt and use to help mitigate some of these threats that we've been seeing.
Before we dive into that, I suppose we should talk about CISA itself. What is CISA? I don't think most of our folks would have heard of it.
Yeah, they're one of those agencies, kind of like DHS, but less well known. They're kind of in the background. It's a governmental agency. Primarily, they've worked in the cybersecurity realm, but they also have a lot of knowledge that comes out into the physical security realm as well. So it's another one of those 3-4 letter agencies that there seem to be so many of that kind of get lost in the shuffle.
Yeah. So this guide, and this is the first time they put out this guide.
This is the first one that I've seen. I haven't seen them put out a venue security guide in the past, so I believe this is the first one.
Okay. And the point of it, as their introduction to it talks about, is to provide, as you mentioned, guidance for venues, recommended best practices, a menu of security options. So do you find in your practice that a lot of venue operators are using this already, or is one of the issues that, the word needs to get out about its existence?
I don't know if it's well known at this point that it's out there. And I think a lot of our experienced venue security folks probably wouldn't have as large of a need for it. I could see this being used as a tool for them to maybe take a look at and make sure they've got all of their I's dotted and T's crossed. But I could see it being used for some of the smaller venues, parades, like hometown parades, maybe areas where we have maybe a less experienced security manager in place or somebody that maybe hasn't done much with venue security before. I think this could probably be a little bit more help for them.
So, walk us through, perhaps independent of this guide, and we'll talk about it in a moment and, sort of compare what it says versus, the work you do, for example, with a lot of your clients. But, what are some of the biggest threats right now to venues? What are some of the security risks that you're seeing?
So some of the biggest ones that we're seeing, of course, active shooter is always a worried one. That's one that always has a tendency to be in the back of people's minds. Unfortunately, we just had the incident down in New Orleans with the vehicle incident, right? And that's something that has been happening pretty regularly, unfortunately, over the last several years. Vehicles are very easy to get a hold of and very easy to use as a weapon. So that's one of those things that I think has a tendency to maybe not get mitigated against as much as it potentially should. But it's also put in here as one of their security, on their security consideration tables in here, vehicle incidents are considered one of the threats that can potentially be mitigated by security measures. So that's one of them. Of course, crowd management's a big one too. We've seen a lot of issues with that over the last few years. So crowd management's another one.
John, so talking about the recent incidents both in New Orleans and Las Vegas involving the Cybertruck, there's been reports in the last couple of days that the driver of that vehicle, who purportedly killed himself before the truck blew up, was getting a lot of his information and instruction through AI, and this is maybe being called one of the first AI terrorist attacks. That proposes obviously an additional concern, an additional layer of threat assessment that you need to develop that wasn't really around for a long time. On the other hand, when you consider that, the availability of this information through simple internet searches, it really isn't that different than someone simply Googling, how do I blow up a truck? It perhaps provides them that information quicker and maybe more accurately, but it certainly presents a new frontier of threat assessment. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think we're going to start leveraging the AI as well to help mitigate threats like that. I think that's going to start becoming much more prevalent as we start to integrate the AI with video cameras and other physical security technologies. I think that'll kind of help combat some of that a little bit as we start to see that develop within the threat landscape itself.
John, also before we move on, from these two incidents, I just want to ask one more follow-up. Both of the alleged perpetrators of these attacks, again, on Bourbon Street and outside the Trump Hotel in Vegas, are former military, they're military veterans. And, there's been much discussion about the impact that their military service had on these attacks. And in one case, there's a direct correlation being made between, the Vegas assailant's time in the service. He was texting his ex-girlfriend the day of the event and talking about how his time in the military might have affected his decision to do what he did. You're a veteran, of course, very distinguished veteran of both the police force and the military. And you're an expert in, evaluating potential threats, including those from patrons, profiling patrons, etc. How does what we've learned in the last couple of days affect that assessment? Do you now have to look at perhaps veterans with some additional scrutiny, given what we're learning, but not something that's totally, unknown, of course, from veterans? So I know that's a long question, but what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, and I think a lot of that is going to come down to providing our veterans with the services that they need upon leaving, our armed forces, or even while still involved in it. And I did a presentation last month to our local ACES International Mid-Michigan group about, the challenges and benefits of hiring veterans for security roles. And one of the things that we kind of discovered during our discussion is how much aid there that is lacking for individuals coming out of active service, especially those men and women coming out of wartime scenarios, and the post-traumatic stress that follows that. So a lot of things can be done. I think educating our civilian sector as well for what to look for and indicators. I'm a huge proponent of training and education. And I just think that, our general population has a tendency to lack in the knowledge of what to look for, those red flags, whether it's a civilian actor or a former military member or an international visitor.
John, you mentioned back to CISA. One of the measures that is discussed is vehicles, right? Vehicle access to these venues. Again, we saw quite tragically on Bourbon Street that a unsuccessful attempt to blockade the streets. I think there was one police car that this perpetrator drove around. Of course, we've now learned about, in many ways, the failure of putting more, stronger security measures in place. Given that New Orleans is hosting the Super Bowl here in a few weeks, given that, California will be hosting the Olympics, the World Cup, Super Bowl here in the next, few years, what is the standard that venues should adhere to when it comes to preventing vehicles from accessing these sites?
It really needs to come down to an access control policy that only allows certain vehicles within a certain area. But it also comes down to making sure that those vehicles that are allowed within those areas are not leaving keys in vehicles. That's pretty common. We've done that on assessments of college campuses before, where only certain vehicles are allowed in certain areas, but then you go check the vehicle itself and the individual operator left the key in the ignition, opening that vehicle up as a potential weapon to anybody that comes across it. Really getting in depth in doing a risk assessment or a security vulnerability assessment around the venue itself to look for those entrance and exit points, areas where vehicles could potentially go around barriers or even through, right? So some barriers that we may look at and say, oh, that's a barrier. It's a barrier to somebody that's just navigating their vehicle around the streets, but is it a barrier to somebody that wants to intentionally push their vehicle through it? A park bench isn't necessarily going to stop something, right? But a dump truck full of gravel will. So we have to kind of look at everything from a holistic standpoint around the venue itself, which can be done through that vulnerability assessment.
John, let's talk about screening patrons entering venues, right? What does the CISA venue guide say about that? And what is, the industry standard that should be followed? Because there's been, dramatic technological improvements in that area. But what should venues be doing with regards to screening patrons?
Well, the venues definitely, and I don't remember if there's anything specifically addressed in the CISA document. I know that it does talk about crowd control, and it does talk about some of the events themselves, but having very limited entrances is one, right? Making sure that we have those entrances that are well staffed, they're well monitored, and they're reduced to the number necessary for pedestrian traffic flow. Making sure that entrances are closed, doors are working properly so that when somebody goes through it, it's secure. Having the technology in place. I know there's a lot of technology that's being used at sports venues now, right? That is not necessarily the traditional metal detector type, right? Where we're using the integration of artificial intelligence to help identify the potential for weapons as people are walking through the weapon detection system. So that's another big one, making sure that we're screening individuals properly as they're coming through into the venue itself.
John, you mentioned active shooters always being a threat, right? How does the CISA venue guide deal with that? And again, what are you seeing as the gold standard these days on dealing with that particular threat?
Yeah, so the CISA guide has a lot of recommendations and between coordination and administration, things that may help. It's got things for security measures, training and exercising is always a huge one. The gold standard nowadays is making sure that you have a prepared workforce, what your security team is ready. And it's not just the security team, it's everybody that understands what to do in the incident of an active shooter situation, that whole run, hide, fight concept that has been adopted. And it's making sure that not just the individuals in charge know, but other organizations are letting their employees know when they're going off for the corporate office space, or they're going off somewhere else, or you're going off to enjoy your time at a venue. It used to be almost taboo. And I still get some clients that are older that say, hey, we don't necessarily want to say this is a possibility within the workplace. Anybody that's in their 20s or 30s at this point have been getting run, hide, fight training since they were in grade school. So it's not the taboo topic that it once was. It really needs to become a normal part of the workplace training module throughout the year.
So, John, speaking of training, so frequently in these incidents, in the fog of them, what breaks down is that communication, right? Is the coordination of responses by many different agencies, many different law enforcement groups. That is so frequently what aggravates the loss rather than the initial incident. Talk to us about, again, what the best practices are there, both as discussed by CISA and in your own practice.
So it's making sure that we have those plans established and in place long before an incident occurs. It's being proactive about it. It's making sure that we as organizations have our communications plan and policy in place for any kind of critical incident, whether it's an active shooter or it's a natural disaster, right? I mean, having a tornado hit a sports venue or some other kind of natural disaster. Having those communication plans in place so that we can communicate not only within the people within our organization, but those federal and government agencies outside our organization clearly as well, making sure that we can get the word out and help get the word back in to receive assistance as needed.
So this resource can be found at CISA.gov. They have a disclaimer on there that this is, of course, only voluntary and it's not comprehensive, as is, of course, our advice. But John, anything else before we wrap up that you think our viewers and listeners should know about this document?
I just think always be on the lookout for new information. I try to keep on about it as I can, but I oftentimes find that stuff will slip past my inbox and I may miss it. So try to information share. And great things like this podcast are a way to do that, making sure that you're finding out something new. And don't be afraid to get into the weeds with a vulnerability assessment for an organization, a venue, or something else, because we don't know what we don't know. And some folks are intimidated not only by the cost to do an in-depth one sometimes, but they're also intimidated by what might be found. Nobody wants to be told the gaps necessarily in their security program or within a facility itself, sporting venue or otherwise. So don't be afraid of it. Generally, a good consultant's going to be there to help you out and help you navigate that and help mitigate a potential loss in the future.
And, all our listeners and viewers, John is one of the best at that. So if you need that service, please contact him. You can access his information through our website. John, thank you so much for joining us and coming back and sharing your vast knowledge and expertise in this area. And please come back and keep us posted as this issue continues.
Absolutely. Thanks, Rich. I appreciate it.